Well, let's get going then. I don't have a pump-up jam like these guys do, but I'll just get right into the intros. I'm Chad Mackley. I'm a senior dev at Tableau. I've been there for about 2.5 years. I'm not a natural public speaker, but I really care about accessibility. I've been on the dev team that's been driving accessibility for the last 1.5 years or so. And so I really was excited at this opportunity to come and share like what we've done and how you guys can build accessibility into your vizzes. So we're going to cover a few things. We'll go through the basics, what accessibility is, why it's important, what kind of disabilities and impairments we're trying to target. We'll then talk about the web accessibility standards and why they're important and which ones are important for this talk. Then we'll go through authoring for accessibility. I'm going to take a viz that was shipped in server, and we're going to do like a makeover and make it accessible. And then we're going to wrap it up with a little demo. I'll do some keyboard, show you the keyboard shortcuts, and show you what we've made. So let's get started. Before we dig into the accessibility side, I want to make sure that we talk about I think it's really important to understand the disabilities and impairments that create this need for accessibility. There's a really wide spectrum of these kind of disabilities that impair us, that can impair us to use a computer system. Vision impairments is a primary one for a visual analytics company, but this has a huge range. And it would definitely affect your ability to see all the details on the screen or even see the screen at all. Limited mobility is also, limited mobility will affect kind of your ability to use a keyboard or a mouse in order to do precision work within the viz. But there's all these other kind of disabilities as well that would affect our ability to use Tableau and the visualizations that we create. So deafness and hearing loss, photosensitivity, learning disabilities, cognitive limitations, and speech disabilities. There's a very wide range of disabilities, and as people who care about accessibility, these are the things that we need to keep in mind as we're authoring. But I want to dive into the vision impairments one a little bit more. I mentioned there's a wide band of these impairments. They can range from color blindness to complete blindness, but I think the best way to get a feel for these is to go through some simulations. So I have a viz. This is a viz that shipped with Tableau server, I think in 9.0. It shows SAT scores broken down by the college they were accepted into as well as the gender. Now I'm going to walk through, I'm going to apply some different filters so you can kind of see what it would look like with these particular disabilities. And I want you to pay attention to what details you start to lose. What information do you start to lose? So the first one here, or the first one will be a red-green color blindness here. So what do you start to lose? And then we have full color blindness. Then we have contrast sensitivity loss. Colors come back, but it's harder to see maybe the text. We have low vision. You can kind of see the shapes of the colors, but you can't read any of the text. And then we have complete blindness, which is very hard to see any details here, right? Now, the whole point is to kind of show you the wide spectrum and to make you think that it's not just blind users we're trying to help. It's all of these different things. But you can also apply the same kind of logic to the limited mobility aspect and all of those other disabilities that I mentioned as well. So this could be that you have a slight tremor and doing mouse work is kind of difficult. Precision mouse work is difficult. Or it could be you're completely paralyzed from the neck down and you can't use a keyboard or mouse at all. Now, with all of these different impairments that we've been talking about, you can imagine there's different technologies that go along with them as well. And these technologies are called assistive technologies. And I want to walk through a few of them just to give you an idea as well. The first one is a screen reader. Screen reader, NVDA, or JAWS, does just that. It reads the text on the screen out to a user. On top of that, though, it adds a layer of navigation. So it will look at the whole page, find the different titles and sections of the page, and then a user can ask their screen reader, not verbally, but through commands, about where are the links, what links do you have, what titles are, what regions are there on the page, and it will read just the titles, and then you can navigate to those places. So instead of listening to the entire page and going through the whole thing, you can bounce quickly between different regions based on the title. Now this is taking text and turning it into, instead of a visual sense, it turns it into an audible sense with the screen reader. But if you have a hearing loss impairment as well, that's not going to work for you. So then you might go to a refreshable braille display, which takes that same text, and instead of turning it into sound, it turns it into, it actually updates the pins on that board, and you can read it in braille what it's saying. But it still takes this text. It needs to bring it all into text in order to translate it to the different sounds, or different senses. For limited mobility, maybe you would use a keyless keyboard. If you don't have full use of all of your fingers, maybe you use a keyless keyboard, and this is based on the different angles that you move these two discs. You can input, the different combinations will input different characters into the system. On top of that, a sip and puff device. If you only have control of your lungs, you can inhale and exhale at different frequencies into with a straw, and it will input different characters into the system as well. So you can imagine that with all of these different disabilities and all these different impairments, we need some kind of standards, right? Some way to address all of them all at once. And the first kind of set of these standards were legal standards, or are legal standards, I should say. I'm not going to dive in too deep on the legal standards themselves, but I want to mention two things. The most important thing is that they are important, that they drive this need for accessibility. They recognize that there are people getting left behind, and they're forcing, no, I shouldn't say forcing, that's a little strong, but it is a huge push to making things accessible. But they are specific to regions, and they are a little bit vague and slow to update. The Section 508, which many of you probably have heard of, is of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Now, the internet in 1973 was a little bit different than it is now, right? So we need something that is not regional and does move faster, and that's where WCAG comes into play. So Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also is pronounced WCAG. It's a very beautiful acronym. That's how you pronounce it, WCAG. This was developed by the World Wide Web Consortium. This is this is an international body that defines the standards between any kind of web technology, from the browser, how do you write the code so the browser can interpret it? How do you how do browsers connect or talk to servers and all of that stuff? But the relationship that we care about is the standard of how do you put stuff in the browser so that Assistive Technologies can pull it out? What's the standard there? The cool thing about WCAG is it is being adopted by these laws. Section 508 has adopted the WCAG standard. If you're WCAG compliant, you'll also be Section 508 compliant now. And a lot of the laws are moving this way. So I'm going to mostly focus on being WCAG AA compliant. So I said AA, what does that mean? There are 3 different levels within WCAG. There's A all the way up to AAA. A is kind of the minimum level of accessibility, whereas AAA is the most stringent. But Section 508 requires AA. AA is kind of being adopted as kind of the standard, even though AAA would be more accessible. So from now on, if I mention it is or is not accessible, I mean it meets or does not meet the AA standard. So AA standard is what we're going to talk about here. And that will get you to legal compliance. Okay, the other way it's broken down is into principles. The WCAG really is just a bunch of requirements. I think there's about 40 requirements, and they're bucketed into the 4 principles. The first one is perceivable. This is about making sure that no matter what senses you have, you can perceive the content that's on the page. Now, if it's text, screen readers can read it out, but if it's an image, and it's only an image, it makes it hard for people to perceive that if they can't read it with a screen reader or with a braille reader. The second one is operable. This is all about making sure that all of the content on your website can be interacted with, regardless of needing a mouse or a keyboard. And then understandable, there's the third one. This is all about making sure that there's clear instructions on what is in the page, what will happen if you interact with the control, making sure they understand what will happen and what is available. And then the last one is robust. And this is mostly around It's mostly focused on the developers like myself about making sure that we add the right code on the page so that Assistive Technologies can, when they inquire elements, they can get to all the other relationships between the different components as well, making sure that we match the standard there. So the last piece I want to mention on WCAG is conformance. It is based on the entire scenario. So you can't say my page is 95% conformant. That's not super helpful, right? If that 5% involves what's called a keyboard trap, you're tabbing around, you hit enter, it opens a dialog, you realize it's the wrong dialog, so you hit escape, the dialog doesn't go away, there's no way to get out of this dialog, you're now stuck. That's not conformant, you don't meet. So we have to make sure that when we build these for accessibility, we're talking about the whole scenario. And the reason that comes into play, especially for Tableau, is that our first goal, well, let me just tell you what our first goal is, which is we want to enable authors to achieve WCAG 2.0 AA conformance for workbooks published to server, online, and public when the workbooks are embedded in a WCAG 2.0 AA conformant web page. And the idea here is that we saw that we were asked a lot about, hey, I have a web page, it's fully compliant, I'd really like to just add a chart to it, but you guys aren't accessible, and you break my compliance. And so that was our first goal. And with 10.2, Server 10.2, we have actually met that. And that's what I'm going to show you, is how do we build the vizzes that will allow you to embed them on your page and not break conformance and still give the richness of Tableau. So let's do it. Let's take this viz that I showed earlier, and we'll make it more accessible. We'll make it compliant, AA compliant. So the way we're going to do this is I'm going to walk through a few requirements that matter for authors, all of the requirements that matter for authors. And then we'll talk about what it is, and then we'll apply it to the viz, and we'll kind of do this. We'll walk through it together. Know that there is documentation online about how to build accessible vizzes. There's documentation on the keyboards and best practices as well. I'll have links at the end that you can take a picture of. The slides will go out, and you can definitely check those out. If this goes too fast, you can definitely get more details and more explanation there. So let's go to the first requirement. The first one is non-text content. It says all non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. That's the requirement. So do we have any non-text content? maybe here and also down here. Like the whole thing is non-text content, right? So how do we deal with this? This is definitely the most important one to get right. We're a visual analytics company, and we're talking about non-text content. How do we get that out? So the first thing, there's two main things I want to mention. The first one is we need to make sure we add good titles and captions to our worksheets. And the second one is we turn on the view data permission. Let me dig into those a lot more. The title and caption, as devs, we've hooked it up so that Assistive Technologies, when they land on a viz, know that the caption is its name. Sorry, let me say that again. Know that the title is its name and that the caption is its description. And when a screen reader will land on that or a Braille display, it will tell you that it'll tell you the name, it'll tell you the description. The second piece is that we want to make sure, actually, sorry, let me keep going with this title. So if we hit this first, if Assistive Technology lands on this first viz, it will read out this title, which is % of students within SAT decile by college. Click college name to highlight. Right, so there's a little extra help text in there, which isn't really a good name. It also has a % on it, which some screen readers will get right, sometimes they won't. So avoiding these symbols is helpful. Avoiding this extra help text is helpful. So let's go ahead and update the titles real quick and add captions. So here we go. Now we've added the titles, we've added the caption. So now if Assistive Technology lands on this first viz, it'll read percentage of students by SAT decile image. Then it'll read the caption, which is percentage of students by SAT decile is a line graph showing percentage of students within each SAT decile. SAT decile is on the x-axis, percentage of students is on the y-axis, each line shows the data for a different academic division. That's a lot more helpful. And if you have low visibility, low vision, you would be able to see the shapes, you'd be able to hear that text, and you would understand kind of what those lines mean. But that's not enough, right? The data is really what we want. We want to know what the data is. And that's where the second one comes into play. That I mentioned turning on the view data permission. The reason you need to turn on the view data permission is we've also hooked it up so that if you land on that viz and hit enter, it'll launch the view data window for the data that's being presented on that slide, or on that viz. And so when you hit enter, it brings up this. This is the view data window. And it's just a text table of all of that data. It's completely compliant. You can interact with it. Screen readers will be able to do everything they do with tables because it's a standard table with all the text in it that you need. So those are the two main things you need to do to make the non-text content accessible. So the next requirement is use of color. This one says the color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information. The reason for this is colorblindness is fairly common, right? I think it's 8% of males and 0.5% of females. That's 1 in 12 males have some kind of colorblindness. And we use color a lot in vizzes. So we kind of have to address the color issue here. So let's take another look at our viz. So up here we have color being breaking up the different colleges. And if you remember with the simulation, when you have no color vision, it's really hard to see which line is which. And down here also, it just turned into a bunch of dots. You can't tell what's going on, which ones are which. So there's a few ways you can do this. Basically, I'm not saying we need to remove color, but we need to kind of dual encode the color. Whatever we're using for color needs to be represented in another way. So for this viz, I'm going to use shapes. So here it is with shapes also. First thing I want to mention is I've changed the color palette as well to use this colorblind color palette. Now let me talk about the colorblind color palette a bit. It is a good first step, but it's not going to solve all your color blindness issues. If you can't see color at all, you won't be able to see that there's orange and blue. But the reason it's orange and blue, or the reason it's a colorblind palette, is it's addressing the most common kinds of color blindness, which are red-green color blindness. So if you have this most common red-green color blindness, you can still see orange and blues just fine. So it helps more people see and use the value of color. And then, yeah, so I added shapes as well, right? So we have here somebody with who has the privilege of full sight, with no color blindness, you can see the shape, you can also see the color and run with it. If you can't see color, you can pick up a shape and follow the shape along the line and see where that's trending. Now down here, another best practice I should mention is make your shapes a little bit bigger. I recognize that these are a little hard to see, but I changed it to a square and a circle, and that would differentiate for people using the viz. You'd be able to see the different thing, even if you can't see the color. Now, another one related to color is contrast. And this is about the contrast. The color of the text needs to contrast with the color of the background at a ratio of 4.5 to 1. Okay, and the reason for that is contrast sensitivity loss. If you're maybe on a presentation slide, the colors will come closer together. But if you have this disability as well, it makes it really hard to see the text. So let's take a look at our viz real quick. In the legend in the top right here, this one's really hard to see, right? It's hard to see for everybody. The contrast ratio is 1.2 to 1. Remember, the standard's 4.5 to 1, so it's definitely below, which makes sense. It's hard to see. But you might also be surprised that this one is also below standard, 3.2 to 1. Now, the way I did this and found these numbers, there's a tool called Color Contrast Analyzer. It's not a Tableau tool. It's a third-party tool. I have a link in the slides. Basically, you sample the color of the text. You sample the color of the background. It'll tell you the ratio. It'll also tell you, it's like a real satisfying green check mark for the AA standard. And then it even has AAA standard on there as well. And it's a really easy tool to use. If you need to worry about it, it's a great tool to use. Go ahead and download it. But I'm going to do something easier, which is just to use the default legends, right? The default formatting, black on white, is always going to be, it's always going to match or meet the standards here. So if you can, use the default formatting. If not, and you want to customize colors, use that color contrast analyzer to make sure. Now also note that I used the shape legend here, not the color legend, for the reason that we just covered. Somebody with full color vision can see the shape, match it to a shape on the viz, and then they can use, their brain will connect that shape is the same color and run with it. But if you don't have that privilege, then you can still follow along. So the next one I do want to talk about is headings and labels. Headings and labels, like I mentioned, screen readers can bounce between different areas on the viz, but they do that through the names of those areas, and the names of those areas are their headings. So we need to make sure that we turn on titles, which we've already covered for the viz. We should turn on the dashboard title, and we should turn on the legend titles and filter titles. And on top of that, there's another requirement that is satisfied by doing that, which is this labels or instructions. And this is all about making sure that when they land in a filter, they know what's going to happen when they interact with that filter. If I check this box, what kind of filter is this? We need the text. And that's not a hard requirement. It makes way more sense to take this viz, which has no titles, and just add the titles to, sorry, these guys that have no titles. We can add the titles, and now everybody, including people with disabilities, will be able to know what those legends and filters are going to affect. Cool. So that's all the requirements that you guys need to know about. That's not all the requirements, but those are all the requirements that authors need to worry about. I've highlighted them here. The rest of them are all the other requirements in WCAG. There's a lot. There's 36 other ones. Some of them are specific to audio-video, which we don't tend to use, but the rest are all for us, the developers at Tableau, to make sure we get correct. So I want to give you an idea of what these other ones are, because I'm sure you're reading them, trying to understand it. So one primary one is keyboard and no keyboard trap. This means that you can use just the keyboard to get around the entire viz and interact with it just the same as if you could with a mouse. It also means the keyboard traps don't exist. You can't get stuck when you're using the keyboard. So we've gone through and we've made that happen. Another one is focus visible. So when you're tabbing around, getting around through the viz, you need to know where that is, because you can't move a mouse around to see where you're at. You got to follow the viz, or follow the focus, excuse me. As you're keyboarding around, you need to follow the focus with an indicator. And on top of that, there's this info and relationships one. This is all about making sure that the viz is associated with the title and the caption. It's just about making sure the legend is associated with its title. It's also about making sure the legends know that there's 6 other legends in there. And for filters, that needs to know its check state and its disabled state or anything like that. Any extra metadata that we can just see because the icons change, we need to make sure there's some text representation as well. So that's what we've been doing as devs on the Tableau team, is we've been trying to make sure that we hit all of these requirements across the board for particular things. Now, we mentioned we had an initial goal, and that goal was about embedded dashboards. That's so that we can make sure that we hit all of these requirements in a particular path, right? There's a path forward now that you can build accessible vizes. It does mean, though, that we haven't quite got to everything on the web, right? So there are things that aren't accessible still. And so for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to basically talk about what things you can't quite use yet. So the first one, back to our viz, the only thing keeping us from full compliance here is this filter. This is a slider filter, and we haven't made them accessible yet. But the good news is, in 10.2, we've made all list filters accessible. This is single value, multi-value, include, exclude list filters. If you want the apply and cancel button, because you've got a lot of options, the apply and cancel buttons are all there. With and without the all option. Basically, anything you do with a list filter is completely accessible. And then with 10.4, we also got to drop downs. So again, include, exclude, all of the search capability, all of that is all accessible. So if you add a list or a drop down filter, you should be good to go. So here, sorry, this is their viz. I've taken out the slider and I've added, I've added a single value list filter here. I also went ahead and added a few other filters based on the college name and the gender, just to give somebody with accessible needs the ability to filter down that data so that when they go back to the viz and hit enter on it, it will only show them what they care about. So by adding more filters that are compliant, it actually makes the overall experience better for everybody. So that's it. We have a fully accessible viz. We've done it. We've done the makeover, right? So here it is. I do want to talk about a couple more things that aren't accessible, though, really fast. So we talked about the filters. Another thing is authenticated data sources. Authentication to Tableau online server and public, totally accessible. But if you have a data source that's behind some authentication, we don't have support for that. And you can imagine that there's a lot of different data sources, a lot of different kinds of data sources, so making sure each one of those is accessible has been more tricky than we expected. And so we haven't quite got there yet. The other one is the toolbar. The toolbar seems very simple. It's just a toolbar with like 5 or 6 options in it. But they launch different dialogues, and those dialogues have other things going on. And so there is a lot there. We are working on the toolbar. We recognize that it's a very important piece, and so we want to make sure that's enabled. That's where we're working now. But at this point, it's not accessible. So in order to turn the toolbar off, when you publish this viz, there's an option. When you copy the embed code, you get this piece. And there's a toolbar option that says yes. You have to turn it to no in order to turn the toolbar off. But as soon as you do that, you can embed that viz into your web page, and you can meet WCAG AA compliance. So now I want to show you that real quick. So I'm going to jump over to that viz embedded into another page, and we're going to just jump around with the keyboard. I have the mouse here. I'm going to set it. I'll set it there just to prove that I'm not using the mouse, and we're going to go for it, right? So here we go. Also, I thought about bringing up a screen reader. If you've ever been in a demo with a screen reader, it's hard for me to talk while the screen reader is talking. So unfortunately, we don't have a screen reader, but let me just jump through with the keyboard real quick. So first, I can tab to the sheets. Hit tab to get to it. I can use the left and right arrows to bounce through them. If I hit space or enter, it will select that sheet and change the sheet, or it just refreshes because it's been too long since I loaded the page. Let's do it again. I'll hit space, changes the sheet. I can then tab to the viz. It gets a blue outline. I want to show you the legends real quick, though, so I can jump to the legends. Again, I can hit up and down arrow. Left and right also works. If I hit space on them, it will filter them out. It'll use the highlight feature to show those. You can do it tab down here and do it with this legend as well. I'm going to shift tab back up to the sheet tabs. I'm going to hit space on the dashboard. I want to go back to the dashboard because that's where our filters are. So I'm going to tab back down to this guy. I can hit enter on the viz here. It'll bring up the view data window. This I can tab through. I can get to the different sheet tabs, or the tabs here. I can get to the link. If I had a screen reader, it would jump to the table and read the table as a screen reader would. I'm going to Alt F4 to close this window. Let's go play with a filter real quick. So here, I can just up and down arrow through this. I can hit the space bar to select the thing, select a legend value, or a filter value. I can shift tab back up here to the search if I wanted to. Now this one only has 3 options, but if your legend had more options, you could then type in different options here. Oops, 2007 is not a valid option. If I arrow down, I can then interact with it as well. I can escape to clear it. Excuse me. So I escape through here, yeah. Yeah, so let's go use the drop down real quick. If I tab down here, I can hit the space bar to open. Again, I can type engineering. It'll pull up just the engineering college. I can deselect that. If I wanted to only select it, I could come here, check the all box, uncheck the all box. We'll add engineering again. Arrow down, space bar, pulls up just engineering. Now if I wanted to go back to the viz. I can shift tab all the way back to the viz. I can hit enter, and now I have a fewer amount of rows, and we can get all those data points. And then, yeah, so we've seen, I think we've seen everything. If I keep going and hit tab, it then jumps out of the viz back to the main page, and I can interact with these links as well. This is not Tableau content, this is my surrounding content. So everything works. It works just fine. So so that's our demo. We've done it. It's published, it's accessible, and I can interact with it. Thanks. Thank you. So let's go back to the slides real quick. Nope. Cool. So I just want to wrap up real quick. Here are the references that I mentioned. If you want to take a picture, go for it. These slides will be on TC Live. If you haven't yet, go to tclive.tableau.com. That's where you get all of the content. That's where I think this will be recorded. The slides will be up there. You can get all the content. It probably will take at least 48 hours, if not a week, to get all that up there, but it will be available. But if you search for authoring views for accessibility, you'll land on the Tableau page, or the help page for walking through how to build an accessible viz. I highly recommend it. Go take a look. The standards and laws that we talked about, the color contrast analyzer for picking your text colors, that's there as well. So just to wrap up, we've covered the accessibility basics. We've covered the standards. We covered how to build an accessible viz. We walked through a quick demo. But really what I want to land on is this. Accessibility is a design choice. You can't just build any viz and it's accessible, unfortunately, at this point. But we realized that this is, I told you that there was like 5 requirements that you guys need to do and a whole bunch that we need to do. This is a partnership, right? We can't do it just as devs. You can't do it just as authors. So we really want to come together and ask you guys for feedback. Right? If you have good ideas about how to make this more accessible, if you've gone through the walkthrough, you tried to do what I just did and make your viz accessible, and you're running into something that's bothering you, send us an email. We want to hear from you. We want to know what we can do better. We've covered the kind of the core stuff that you put into all vizes, and we want to know what's next. We want to know what pieces we should handle. We have ideas for sure, but we want customer input. So again, you can send us an email. I'll be here afterwards. You can come chat with me. Jorge in the green shirt, he's also part of the team. You can chat with him. We'd love to hear from you guys. And again, this is my first presentation, so if you want to give me some feedback, I would love it. Let me know how I'm doing and what I can do better. Related sessions. Tomorrow, there's one about federal government executive dashboarding and adoption. That might be interesting for the crowd here, as well as go with the flow practical dashboards, which will kind of cover how to make simple but effective dashboards. Cool, and that's it. I'm open for questions, and or you can feel free to leave. Thank you guys very much. Yeah.
Are you working with any developers of limited, with disabilities to find out how they're interacting?
That's a great question. The question was, are we working with developers or users who have disabilities to make sure we're doing the right thing? We have been working with a third-party consulting firm that knows this stuff better than we did. We wanted to make sure we're doing the right thing, so we consulted with them just to make sure they had great ideas. They had some usability studies that we walked through. We heard from actual users. Yeah, and so it's definitely enlightening to make sure that we know the whole spectrum of what kind of issues we're getting. Yeah.
So you have developers who are able to develop, you have persons with limited, with disabilities who are able to develop their own business?
So we aren't, good question. So if you do have, if you have a need for accessibility, you won't be able to author the vizzes. Yeah, but you can view the vizzes. And the idea there is we wanted to make sure that the largest group of people, which I think are viewers, I know are viewers, I should say, we can build accessible vizzes that they can get through before we get to the authoring stuff. Good question. Anybody else? Yeah, go for it.
Going through this process, does it make sense to publish multiple versions? The changes you made kind of conflict with some of the design comments in other presentations we talked about design. Does
Sure.
it make sense to do both?
Yeah, so the question is, does it make sense to do, to make 2 different vizzes? I would suggest no. I would suggest that it might be the tendency to make an accessible version and a non-accessible version. The problem with that is the accessible version will get left behind, potentially, or it won't have the same content, or somebody with disabilities is now being told they need to go over there versus everybody else who can go over here, right? It becomes tricky in that sense. On top of that, like what we found was that a lot of times when we would have to do something for accessibility, which is initially what you kind of feel like, oh, we have to do it because of accessibility. We realized that it was actually like very freeing to like, oh wait, this is actually a really good practice, right? For like keyboard layout, like it was always like, well, what should we do to get to different options? Like, well, there's guidelines, there's a standard for them. Let's just do that, and it works for everybody. It's consistent, and it works, right? So we found that these accessibility guidelines actually do help not just people with accessibility needs, but everybody. And so I would recommend, if you can, try to make one, and if that's hard, send us an email. Anything else? Yeah, in the back. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, so the question is, are there any types of vizzes that I'd recommend that tend to be more accessible? Because the line chart we showed is a little bit harder to see. I think that, let me say this, I think bar charts are super accessible, especially when you hit the view data. It aggregates all that really well. I think the line charts with the shapes helps, as long as you make the size bigger. I think, the scatter plots are a little bit trickier just because they are, there's a lot of different marks going on, right? I think really the idea is you kind of want to simplify what's there. And again, this helps, it might go against some design patterns, but I would say like by simplifying the message, like you're really trying to show a message. You're trying to, if you're doing this for a story or for a chart in your article or something like that, you're usually trying to show a message. And by simplifying all the noise out and focusing on that point you're making, it also helps people with disabilities by simplifying to that thing as well. There's less data, there's less noise, I guess I would say. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah.
What's the best practice? Because with the scatter plot and the line chart, everything is symbols. So what do you do for a pie chart?
A pie chart?
Yeah.
Labels. I would turn on labels. But any way you want to dual encode, right? Just if you use colors, which again are great, you definitely need to use that same, whatever you're using to color it, you need to add it some other way. Labels or, I guess labels for that case. Yeah. Yeah. Tooltips. Tooltips are not accessible. At this point, the way this works, you can tab to the viz itself, but you can't tab to individual marks and get around through the marks. And so in that case, you wouldn't be able to interact with individual marks. Good question. Yep.
So to follow up on that,
Yeah.
our client demands a lot of text on our dashboards. Do you guys have any tips for controlling font size display issues? So some of our users use the system font jack way up to like 150% or something. It makes it super ugly.
Interesting.
Are there ways to sort of balance that layout constraint versus text? I mean, that's a pretty common.
Yeah.
Our fonts are really small.
Yeah, so the question is, if with people who generally turn up the font size on dashboards, sometimes it messes out the layout. I would say send me an email with that link. I would love to see the actual example and figure out what's going on there. Yeah, it's a super interesting case. Yep. Yeah. So the automatic summary is done by a company, Automated Insights, I believe it is. It's a third-party company, and it is actually super cool. It's really cool. And you can integrate that in as to generate your captions. And I would definitely recommend if that's something you're interested in, yeah, take a look at Automated Insights. I think they have a booth in the Data Village. In terms of what's coming, I can't say a whole lot, but I will say we are working on toolbars, and we have a lot of ideas of where we could go. There's plenty of stuff we could do. So if you guys have feedback of what's limiting you, yeah, let me know. Yeah.
And so when you had the shapes of line graph,
Mhm.
you still need to do a dual graph, like put the shapes on top of line graph.
Yeah, so what I ended up doing to dual encode the shapes on the line graph, it is a dual axis. I've synchronized the axes so that they don't ever get out of sync, and then I just hid the one on the right. Yep. Yep.
So we do a lot of producing things in Tableau and we export to PDF.
Mm-hmm.
Do the PDF files have the data in them to be able to put the titles and things to integrate that?
So they definitely will have the titles and captions. I'm not actually sure how we export to PDF in terms of what will be there. My guess is, if you add titles and captions, there'll definitely be titles and captions there. I'm not sure what happens when you navigate in a PDF with a screen reader. I would definitely have to look into that, but it's a good question. Anything else? Yeah, go for it.
Is there a way to control what order the tabs go in? Here's something that goes from left to right in the next row.
Yeah, good question. So how can we control the tab order? At this point, we don't have a way for you to manually add the tab order. The way that it's done actually right now is the first thing that's added to the dashboard gets rendered first in the DOM, if you will. Speaking nerd talk here, but the HTML, it's the first thing that gets added to the DOM. And then so the order that it's in the DOM is the same order that it'll execute with tab order, and that order is the order that you add them to the dashboard. Now, that's kind of frustrating because you can't change it. However, we do have, that is definitely a bug that we found, and we're working with the dashboards team to try to get that fixed so that's just the natural order, and you shouldn't have to worry about it. That's our goal.
So if I, assuming I'm cool, if I then remove legend and then manually add it back in, does it then put it at the bottom of that list?
I think it would.
Still associated with that?
I think it would put it at the bottom of that list, yeah. But by adding the title, let's think. Let me double check. Think for a second. I think for legends, there is an association between the legend and the visit cell, regardless of where it's at. Do you have a question? Okay. Anything else? Cool. Oh, one last one. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. No, I remember hearing this feedback, and I really like it. We are focused. We're focused on the viewing scenario versus the authoring stuff, but it's definitely a thing that we've talked about as when we get to authoring, if we get to author, or like when we get to authoring, I should say, how do we do that? Because yeah, it is very interesting. All right. Well, thank you guys very much. I'll be down here if you have more questions or just want to chat or yeah. Thank you guys.